Hello, my name is James Matsakis. This is my Literacy and Numeracy Assignment 2 video. So immediately when I began the online test on which I'm going to reflect on, I began to panic when I saw the nature of the first few questions being more than just your usual equation plus minus division. Numeracy has never been my strong point, and mathematical questions that require a deeper level of thinking than the aforementioned, multiplication, subtraction, causes my brain to kind of switch off in a way that it never really does with literacy, which is the area that I consider to be my strongest as a teacher of humanities. So when I was attempting the first few questions of the numeracy section of the test, my main goal was to attempt these questions without the use of a calculator for me to test my actual understanding of the formula of how to work out complex equations rather than just entering into a calculator and finding the result. This took me a lot longer than I initially had anticipated, working it out without a calculator and going back to the basics really of figuring out a mathematical equation without the use of technology. It did take me a lot longer than I initially thought that it would. So as I began working my way through the entirety of the test and all the numeracy section, it became really clear that I am capable of working out these complex kind of questions, the ones that do require more than just a what's 1 plus 1 answer. But it does take me a lot longer than number one than I anticipated, and number two than it did when I was in high school and doing maths on a regular basis. So my results on the numeracy section of the test, they definitely indicated to me that I do need to revise a lot of just the basics of numeracy. As I mentioned, I haven't really done much numeracy like in its most basic form and such as formulas and stuff since I moved from high school to university all those years ago. And so just like any kind of skill, without constantly using it and without revising it, it does become redundant and it does kind of fade away over time. And my results on the numeracy section definitely indicate that that is what's happened. My results also indicated in the numeracy section at least that a large portion of my troubles with numeracy throughout the years, not just on this test, but throughout my schooling years, have been largely mental, due to the fact that if I see a question that is a bit more complex than your average equation, my mind kind of does automatically put it into the too hard basket, hence why I have such an urge to use a calculator and resort to technology instead of using it with my own kind of brain. I do believe this mental state is very common amongst people who don't really see themselves as mathematicians. They don't see themselves as being good at numeracy, including myself. And I feel like, a large part of it is definitely mental. It's kind of breaking past that barrier of putting it into the too hard basket, sitting down and actually figuring out how you're going to solve this equation. And that I noticed was definitely my weakness throughout the test, was putting stuff just in the too kind of hard basket rather than sitting there and taking the time to work it out step by step as you would on an exam or when you were in high school. So when I eventually did reach section 16 of the test and the numeracy part ended and the literacy part began, my mind kind of exited that state of panic that it was in the numeracy section, and I felt a lot more comfortable straight from the beginning of the literacy section. As a teacher of humanities, literacy has always kind of been my strong point, and it's the area that I feel the most comfortable in. However, as I made my way through the literacy test, it was very surprising that I was actually forgetting a lot of the basics of literacy and just the English language in general, basics that you do learn in the early years of, primary school, year 7, year 8, basic kind of skills. I was forgetting them. In question 27, for example, I was tasked with identifying the adverbs in a sentence. And I read the question a few times, I read the possible answers, and I found myself kind of frantically trying to remember what an adverb actually was without basically giving up and Googling it. Much like my experience with the numeracy section, the literacy section led me to believe that even if an area is your strongest, or you perceive it as your strongest area, as myself with literacy, it is still important to revise those basics. Otherwise, they do fade away, and you do forget things over time, such as the adverb question. I hadn't seen an adverb by definition since my high school, even primary school days. So it is, even if it is your stronger area, it is important to revise those basics. At university in particular, literacy revolves largely, if not exclusively, around the writing of essays, the constructions of reference lists, all those kind of, forming a coherent argument, all those type of things that dwell in the higher kind of section of Bloom's taxonomy. And as a result of that, the lower kind of section does fade away over time because it's not used, especially at the university level when you get to third year, fourth year. Certainly, while the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, they are crucial and they are the end goal for anyone doing any kind of learning or education. But it's important, even with that end goal in sight, not to forget the lower section of the taxonomy, which are kind of the building blocks and the foundation on which you can build your skills to reach the higher level. So it's important to note that although the lower order kind of areas of the taxonomy seem pretty useless when you are dealing with the higher end, they're really not, because they provide the scaffolding which builds the whole taxonomy, which builds the pyramid. Without the scaffolding and without the base of a building, the whole thing will collapse. So it's important to constantly revise, much like what I said with mathematics, constantly revise these basics. Otherwise, there's no point in trying to do the top if you can't even do the bottom. So in terms of numeracy, my performance in the aforementioned test kind of leads me to believe that my perceived problems with numeracy are largely due to a mental state of mind when I come across questions that require a more deeper understanding, and understanding that I myself don't think that I have. This kind of self-doubt when approached with something that's unfamiliar or something that you believe you're not good at, it's common across all areas with all kinds of people. For me personally, I believe that if I were ever to teach exclusively numeracy, I would implement strategies that deal with learning formulas and perfecting formulas and just perfecting the basics rather than being bogged down in the complexities of mathematics. Just work on the basics. From there, once you master the basics, you can build on that and then eventually work your way towards the higher end of Bloom's taxonomy. And in the terms of mathematics, you can work your way up until the higher kind of questions, the ones that require a lot more thinking and a lot more depth. So as I said, as a teacher of numeracy, I would definitely implement strategies which kind of work on equations and formulas. Once you get the equations mastered and the formulas down pat, a vast majority of equations will become routine rather than looking at them and just freaking out straight away. So overall, my performance on the test informs me that as a teacher of both literacy and numeracy, I believe that the basics are just as important as the higher end complex kind of skills that you see on Bloom's taxonomy. In numeracy, the formulas and the basic working of equations must be constantly refreshed in order to stop them from kind of rusting away, as what has clearly happened with me, judging by the results of the test. Likewise, in English, the basic fundamentals of the English language, punctuation, structure sentence, spelling, they all must constantly be revised to stop you from making those kind of amateur mistakes. It's easy, very easy to get bogged down in the complexities of literacy and the complexities of numeracy, especially when you are at university and you're constantly working in the upper two levels of the taxonomy and never really reaching or revising the bottom levels of the taxonomy. It's very easy to get bogged down and forget that the lower end exists, but the higher end can't exist without the lower end. So in terms of how this information might enhance my discipline areas, in the humanities, especially in history, which is my main focus, it's very much required from year 9 onwards to be writing essays and forming arguments in history. To do that, you do need those basic skills that I mentioned before: punctuation, spelling, structure sentence, adjectives, adverbs, the whole lot. Those need to be mastered by the time you reach year 12s and you sit your end of year exams. So in order to reach that mastery of these basics, I would definitely implement in my history classrooms the basic structure of how to write an essay, providing the students with the guidelines on how to write essays, kind of giving them the structure on which they can build their knowledge and build their skills upon. As I mentioned before, without the structure, there can't be any kind of building going. In terms of mathematics, again, this can be done even within the history classroom by looking at, say, if you are studying the First or Second World War, through looking at casualties and the construction of pie graphs to determine the different casualties and where those different casualties came from. Each country suffered tremendous losses, and to try and figure out who kind of suffered the most losses. Although it seems mundane at first, these kind of activities work on all the basics of literacy and numeracy, such as, formulas to work out, plus, minus, division, percentages, all that kind of stuff. So while it may seem mundane, and I know it does, the skills that you use and the skills that you will revise when doing that, they will definitely help in the future, because without knowing, you are revising through working out these questions, such as the amount of casualties in World War II. It may seem mundane, but it does work those skills. So overall, the test has been a great eye-opener for me, actually, that despite where you think you are in terms of your academic career and your skills in both literacy and numeracy, it's important to revise the basics, otherwise they do fade away over time. And I definitely see that as what's happened with myself. I'd be very interested as well to see some of the other videos from the other students to see how they did. I feel with myself that I've been very honest here by saying I thought that I was going to be doing a lot better than I was with these basic kind of questions. And it does just go to show that it is all well and good if you can write a 5,000 word essay, but if you can't form a basic sentence or identify spelling mistakes within a basic sentence, then clearly you are doing something wrong.